Hello, my name is Dr. Kate Jackson-Meyer, and I'm here to talk to you today about healing together around moral distress. It is a testament to Benedictine's commitment to offer excellent care, to support its associates and workforce, and to following through on Catholic healthcare that they have invited me to speak to you today. Unfortunately, in light of the coronavirus pandemic, moral distress is an urgent issue facing healthcare professionals. By acting now, you will be able to be the source of support for your healthcare team as they tackle this issue. Importantly, by talking about this now and offering interventions now, you will be able to control the narrative around moral distress. In this way, your healthcare team will see themselves as working with the organization, working within the organization in order to build moral resilience, in order to overcome moral distress. So today I'm going to talk to you about what moral distress is, how it may be taking form during the pandemic. I have a case for you to look at, and then we're going to think through together some interventions that you can use to help your organization heal from moral distress. So what is moral distress? Andrew Jameton introduced this term in 1984 to describe a special stress that nurses experience when trying to offer what they think is right or proper care, but are unable to do so for whatever reason, usually due to institutional constraints. So Jameton's definition was moral distress arises when one knows the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. Since then, the term has taken hold. It's been applied to many different other areas of healthcare, and there's been new thought about how to expand the definition. In 2016, Campbell, Urich, and Grady tried to think about expanding the term, and in doing so, they offered some really interesting insights about different ways that moral distress has been used and what those different ways share. So usually, moral distress is describing a situation where a healthcare professional knows the right thing to do, but they're constrained. This then causes them to experience an initial distress during the time of the event, and then this is usually followed by a reactive distress or a moral residue. So you're unable to do the right thing in the moment, and then the stress follows in some kind of other way. And the effects of moral distress are manifold. They can include undermining moral integrity, and very problematically, it can lead to burnout. In 2009, Epstein and Hamrick gave us some additional ways of thinking about the constraints that lead to moral distress. So they thought about this in terms of internal constraints and external constraints. Are things that a healthcare professional might feel within themselves, maybe self-doubt or a perceived feeling of powerlessness. External constraints can be things like inadequate staffing, lack of support, some kind of policies that are preventing what they think is right action. Epstein and Hamrick in 2009 theorized that the reactive distress or the moral residue that's left over from these events can actually build on themselves. So this is called the Crescendo Effect. So the idea being that when a healthcare professional faces a situation of moral distress, they experience this initial distress, and then there's this leftover reactive distress, and then that builds up. So the next event of moral distress then is experienced at a heightened level, and then the next experience at an even greater level. So this is a theory, and of course the theory then is problematic when we're thinking about how moral distress may be manifesting during the coronavirus pandemic. And then what are these effects of moral distress? Very importantly, the effects of moral distress can be experienced on the physical level, on the mental level, and on the spiritual level. This means that anything that we do to address moral distress also needs to address the myriad ways that moral distress can be manifesting itself. So on the emotional level, somebody could be feeling anxiety or bitterness. On the physical level, they could be having a difficult time sleeping. On the spiritual level, they could be having certain kinds of distress around their spiritual life and faith. Now, moral distress is distinct from other kinds of events. So it is different from moral uncertainty. So moral uncertainty is when you face an ethical situation and you're not sure what to do. In moral distress, the healthcare provider knows what to do. It's just that there are these restraints that are preventing them from acting in the way that they think is the best way possible. Jameson also clarified that moral distress is not a moral dilemma. So in a moral dilemma, you ought to do A and you ought to do B, but you can't do both. These are not situations where somebody thinks that they need to do both kinds of things. This is a situation where they know what is right, and being unable to enact that proper care is the source of the distress. Moral distress may be related to, but it's distinct from emotional or psychological stress. So this can be a component of moral distress, but again, moral distress is an ethical event. It's also different from PTSD. PTSD may be related to moral distress. It may be experienced along with moral distress, but PTSD is specifically about fear. Moral distress, this ethical event. Moral distress is also different from moral injury. Moral injury comes out of psychology to describe the special stress that veterans experience when in combat. So this is just a different context. Moral distress is also different from moral fatigue, which is I'm in a situation and I'm just too exhausted to kind of think through what might be the right action. Certainly something that I know many of us might be feeling in the pandemic, maybe just being too tired to figure out what is the best mask to wear right now, or how do I want to weigh these risks about going to the grocery store or not. You're just too tired to kind of think through and do that mental moral math. That's not moral distress because you know what the right thing is. Moral distress is also distinct from compassion fatigue, which may be experienced along with moral distress, but compassion fatigue is just the kind of exhaustion that comes about of being involved in a line of work that involves so much empathy, and it might be difficult to conjure up that empathy and compassion all the time. But again, distinct from moral distress and it being an ethical event, and moral distress taking on effects that happen at the physical, psychological, and spiritual levels. So then, how is moral distress taking form during the pandemic? So go ahead and pause the video and think about these questions. One thing is clear is that there are new constraints. So Jameson offered us these institutional constraints. New thinking is thinking about internal and external constraints. During the pandemic, the constraints of moral distress are very new. So there are constraints from physical distancing and isolation, the constraints of not having enough PPE, which was especially a concern at the beginning of the pandemic, being constrained by demands of the state or demands of surveyors that are telling you how your organization needs to handle the social distancing protocols. Uncertainty and lack of knowledge, not knowing the information, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. That's a new kind of constraint. And now that moral residue that we talked about before, this is happening on a larger scale due to the length of the pandemic and the number of patients affected. So if that crescendo effect is true, we have really a big issue that we need to deal with healthcare professionals who are going to be experiencing enhanced and heightened moral distress in light of the coronavirus pandemic. And so then the effects of moral distress are going to be intense, long-lasting, and likely across the whole healthcare system. Now we're going to turn to a case study to think more about how moral distress may be manifesting during the pandemic. This case is adapted from an article that ran in the Duluth News Tribune celebrating the work of Benedictine Living Duluth. So here's the case. Patty's parents are living at Benedictine Living Duluth, a long-term care facility. Her mother, 94, is in an assisted living unit, while her father, 95, is in a separate memory care unit. During the height of the pandemic, she, Patty, struggled with being unable to see her parents. The staff at the facility helped to facilitate video phone calls between Patty and her parents when she was unable to visit. As the COVID restrictions started to lift, she could visit her parents outside. Eventually, the facility was able to reunite Wheeler's parents, who hadn't seen one another in person since the pandemic started, as they live in separate units. Now that the family has received the vaccine, they can all see each other more frequently. But Patty and the staff struggle with how much the parents declined cognitively and emotionally over the last year and a half. They grieve the lost time, and they worry about what the Delta virus will mean for the future. So I'd like you to pause the video and think about these questions regarding the case. How did the constraints of COVID safety measures undermine what is typically thought of as proper care? How might this have caused moral distress for those involved with caring for Patty's parents? How might moral distress be manifesting now? And how might it take form in the future for those caring for these patients? Now I'd like you to pause the video. I think that case shows the different ways that moral distress takes form, and also the different people that are experiencing it and the different ways that they are experiencing it. Another aspect of moral distress during the pandemic is how the event of moral distress is affecting how people are thinking theologically. So this can raise issues around theodicy, wondering around why a good God would let bad things happen. It raises questions about God's goodness. And it may raise questions about the common good, which is this idea that all of our goods are intertwined. This is where Catholic healthcare can be really helpful, utilizing the resources that you have, the chaplains that you have, to help think through these complex and profound questions. All right, so how do we move forward from moral distress? Moral resilience is usually touted as the antidote to moral distress. So what is moral resilience? In 2016, Rushton and Kurtz gave this very helpful definition of moral resilience. Moral resilience is defined as the capacity of an individual to sustain or restore their integrity in response to moral complexity, confusion, distress, or setbacks. So how do you build moral resilience? You build it through a renewed sense of purpose and a connection to one's work. So ways to do this. So one way to do this is through education. Let people know about moral distress. Let your associates know about moral distress. This can be done through roundtables, webinars, handouts, videos like this. Another way is to offer assessments of moral distress, and I'm going to talk about two of those. So one assessment for moral distress is called the Moral Distress Thermometer, and you can see it here on the screen. Woschel and Weaver came up with this in 2013, and you can see it's a very rough picture form of thinking about moral distress. This would just give you just a sense of how people are feeling about the issue. In 2019, Epstein et al. Put together the measure of moral distress for healthcare professionals. On the screen, I have a copy of it here, and you can see that it has 27 points of events that could cause moral distress. Depending on how you use it, you may have to get their permission, but it is a way of measuring the level of moral distress. This is particularly for acute care settings where most of the moral distress research has been done. But these events, I think, are telling about the ways moral distress can manifest and may be manifesting now. So go ahead and pause the video and take a moment to look at this measure of moral distress and think about if any of these experiences could be true at your organization. So after you've offered some kind of educational opportunities for moral distress, maybe perhaps after you've offered some measurements of moral distress, then it's key to offer interventions to help build moral resilience. So what are some of the strategies? This has been studied primarily in acute care settings, but a lot of these strategies are going to have, I think, some import for long-term care facilities as well. So some of the things that have been done are virtual communication boards. So Cinda Rushton at Johns Hopkins put together moral resilience rounds where nurses could talk about moral resilience and moral distress in light of the coronavirus pandemic. There have been mindfulness exercises that people have found helpful, different types of trainings. In 2017, Sacheo, Anderson, and Connor did a study on interventions for moral distress. They offered the following interventions: a 1-hour webinar, a book club focusing on relationships. The book was called See Me as a Person, and then a 4-hour retreat. The results show that any intervention decreased moral distress to some level. So having a book group, having a 4-hour retreat, this was helpful in lowering moral distress. But even more importantly, the staff that participated in those interventions talked about how supported they felt by their organization. The mere act of introducing the interventions helped them to feel connected. That is going to be key here. In the 2020 article I wrote on moral distress for the Catholic Health Association, I suggested that we have something called moral health rounds. So moral health rounds would be an interdisciplinary team that leads rounds relating to moral distress. The interdisciplinary team would be made of a social worker, a chaplain, and an ethicist. So these are 3 people that are getting at the different aspects of how moral distress affects healthcare workers. The rounds would be done in order to discuss ethical issues. So this would be cases where healthcare professionals felt as if they were unable to offer the care that they needed. This is around an ethical issue. It seemed to have caused moral distress. And the interdisciplinary team leads rounds focused on these case studies where people can talk about these issues. The idea is if there's one interdisciplinary team or different interdisciplinary teams that are meeting regularly with different associates and healthcare professionals, they're going to start to see patterns emerge about how moral distress is taking form in your organization. And that knowledge can be really helpful as far as instituting institutional changes that are necessary or offering support on a larger scale. Allowing associates to meet with an interdisciplinary team is also going to open up the lines of communication because they'll feel more comfortable, I think, talking to this team of people who can then go and process the information, see the patterns, and then present it to people that are higher up. Because moral distress and moral resilience happen on an individual level but occur within an institution, having this team be a liaison between individuals and higher-ups in the institution, I think will be a very important way of moving forward. It is my hope that it would become clear what kind of interventions would be helpful in addition to the moral round. So perhaps the book club you might see would be an option after having these rounds. Or perhaps a retreat might seem like a viable option after getting the feedback from these rounds. Moral distress and its effects on the psychological, physical, and spiritual levels also mean that Catholic healthcare is uniquely positioned to offer support for moral distress. We have resources from Catholic healthcare that we can use. Notions about solidarity and what that means, a profound commitment to vocation, to developing a vocation, to thinking about vocation and what that means, and a commitment to caring for the whole person. I believe Benedictine is especially well equipped to help healthcare professionals heal from moral distress in light of its commitments to hospitality, stewardship, respect, and justice. Culling from the resources of Benedictine, using the terms of hospitality, stewardship, respect, and justice are going to be crucial for helping associates build up a narrative where they understand themselves as important to the organization, as they understand their vocation in terms of what it means to work at Benedictine. Moral distress is an urgent issue facing healthcare professionals. There are ways forward. Benedictine has the tools to address this issue. By acting now, you will be able to control the narrative around moral distress. By implementing interventions now, you will be the organization that is helping your workforce to heal from moral distress. They will feel more connected with your organization. They will see their vocation in light of working at Benedictine. Catholic healthcare is equipped to deal with this. Benedictine is equipped to deal with this. Moral resilience is on the horizon. We need to offer healthcare professionals resources to discuss this, to name it, and then to move forward from it. I leave you with this question. What educational strategies, measurement tools, and/or interventions may be helpful for your organization to implement in order to heal from moral distress and to build moral resilience in your organization? It's likely that there will be many things that are needed. It's not just going to be one. But together and through your organization, we will be able to overcome this. Thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for all you've done for Catholic healthcare. And thank you for your commitment to caring for your workforce and for caring for your residents during the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you.